Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. Early on, in the first part of his study, Ressentiment, Max Scheler is going to talk about sources of this dynamic of ressentiment, and he's really going to single out two of them in particular: revenge, the desire for revenge, and envy. That doesn't mean that those are the only affects or emotions that play a role in it. He talks about malice, in envy, he talks about jealousy, the competitive drive, he talks about rancor, hatred, a term that we actually generally keep in English, schadenfreude, which is delight in another's misfortune, malice, spite. All of these can actually figure into it, as well as another very important drive or feature, the desire to put down, to detract, to try to pull somebody down. But he's going to single out revenge and envy as the most important, the most powerful sources of ressentiment. And he tells us that the most important source, for several reasons, is going to be thirst for revenge or desire for revenge. He's using different terms. There is an affect. We are oriented towards taking vengeance on people that we think have it coming. And this is going to be particularly important, not just because it does in fact lead to ressentiment, but also because even envy has a certain aspect of revenge to it, as well, as we'll see. So he tells us the very term ressentiment indicates we have to do with reactions which presuppose previous apprehension of another person's state of mind. Why do we take revenge? Let's think about that for a moment. Because not only does somebody do something that we don't like, maybe they injure us, they humiliate us in some way, they damage our goods, whatever it happens to be, but we also think they did that, they chose to do it. If they didn't do it deliberately, they did it because they didn't pay attention, because they don't care about us. They have some sort of negative orientation towards us. So he says, the desire for revenge, in contrast with all active and aggressive impulses, is a reactive impulse, always preceded by an attack or an injury, or at least the appearance of that. But he says we have to make a very important distinction here. It is not the same thing as the impulse for reprisals or for self-defense, even when he says this reaction is accompanied by anger, fury, or indignation. So how is it different from these? Well, reprisals are done right at the time. So, let's take a great example of, what people talk about these days. I say something to you that you don't like, and you, as we say, clap back. You say something to me that is intended to make me feel bad. I think that you look stupid. Well, you're ugly. Or, how stupid do you have to be to hang out with somebody else who's stupid? You can come up with 100 different responses. So he says that if an animal bites its attacker, this is not revenge, right? Now, if an animal were to sneak around and bite its attacker later on, okay, that could be revenge, right? And we do see animals doing those sorts of things. An immediate reprisal against a box on the ear, somebody smacks you in the head, doesn't fall under this heading. Nor does self-defense. somebody attacks you, you immediately respond to them. That's not the same thing as revenge. So he says, how do we distinguish revenge? Two essential characteristics. So first of these is that there's some sort of postponement, right? It's temporarily or at least momentarily checked and restrained. The response is postponed to a later time, and he calls it a blockage. It's caused by the reflection that an immediate reaction would lead to defeat and a concomitant pronounced feeling of inability and impotence. So revenge is taken by somebody who cannot engage in a reprisal immediately. They have to postpone it. This is an important aspect of it. So he says, revenge, based as it is on an experience of impotence, is primarily a matter of those who are weak in some respect. Furthermore, it is of the essence of revenge, this is the second characteristic, it always contains the consciousness of tit for tat. So it is never a mere emotional reaction. There's a sense in which you're setting things right. You are justifying things, right? You are rectifying matters by taking your revenge. And so both of these are important, essential characteristics for this source of ressentiment. And he says these two characteristics make revenge the most suitable source for the formation of ressentiment. Why? Well, because it leads through a progression of feeling ultimately into that. And one of the examples that he's going to use for this is actually vindictiveness. He's going to, this is jumping ahead a little bit, says impulses of revenge lead to ressentiment the more they change into actual vindictiveness. Now, what's the difference between revenge and vindictiveness? Well, vindictiveness is a more overarching, global, lasting state of affairs. He says that if the desire for revenge remains permanently unsatisfied, so there's an impotence there, and especially if the feeling of being right is there, then we get vindictiveness. They are instinctively and without a conscious act of volition drawn towards events which may give rise to vengefulness, seeing injurious intentions in all kinds of perfectly innocent actions and remarks, great touchiness. He says the vindictive person is always in search of objects. They're always looking for occasions in which they can attribute something bad to somebody else and then take some sort of real or imagined revenge against them. But they're going to pick their targets, right? They're not going to go after the people that are too powerful. So he says, this vengeance restores the damaged feeling of personal value, their honor. It brings satisfaction for the wrongs they have endured. When it's repressed, when you can't actually follow through on the vindictiveness the way that you'd like to, what does that lead to? That leads to ressentiment. A process, he says, intensified when the imagination of vengeance too is repressed, and finally the very emotion of revenge itself. Only then does this state of mind become associated with something else very characteristic of ressentiment, the tendency to detract from the other person's value, to try to pull them down, to try to say something about them that would be critical, that would hurt them in some way, often though it doesn't work at all. And we're going to come back to some of the other negative emotions and how they could be a little bit different than revenge in just a moment. But we should talk next about envy, which is another really important source of this. And he talks about envy, jealousy, and the competitive urge. Now, what does that mean? So envy and jealousy in English, a lot of people blur these together. Envy, you want to have what the other person has. Jealousy, you want other people to keep their hands off your stuff. So if you want somebody else's spouse, you are envious. If you're worried about them sleeping with your spouse or your spouse sleeping with them, you are jealous, right? You want the car that they have, you're envious. You want them not to take your car. You're worried about that, you're jealous. And then we have the competitive urge or competitive desire. And all of these can lead to ressentiment. Not necessarily, though. So he says, envy, as we understand it in everyday usage, is a feeling of impotence which we experience when another person owns a good which we covet. They have something else that we desire. So they've got the job, we didn't get the job. They've got money, we are broke. They've got a beautiful body, we are kind of fat and out of shape and old. It could be anything that you want. They get to shoot videos and people watch them. You don't. We could go on and on and on. You've got a YouTube channel that some people watch. Other people have YouTube channels that millions of people watch. You can be very envious of anything. Anything can furnish an occasion for envy. And he says that this tension between desire and non-fulfillment does not lead to envy until it flares up in hatred against the owner. Why? Because the owner is falsely considered to be the cause of our privation. So if I don't have a beautiful body and I go to the gym and I see these other people and they do, and I'm watching how much they can lift, and they pull up their shirt and they've got washboard abs, or pick whatever else you want, right? I'm like, oh, they're strutting their stuff, they're taking something away from me. No, they're not doing anything like that. You want a body like that? Well, you can put in the time that they're putting in. Might not happen, but it's certainly possible for you. And if you're interpreting what they're doing as somehow taking something away from you, well, that's a problem with envy there, right? So he says, our factual inability to acquire a good is wrongly interpreted as a positive action against our desire, and he calls this a delusion, a causal delusion. The experience of impotence and the causal delusion, he says, are essential preconditions of true envy. If we're just displeased that somebody else has a good, that can be an incentive for acquiring it through work, purchase, violence, or robbery. Envy, he says, occurs when we fail in doing so and feel powerless. And he's got a really interesting side remark here. He says, it's a great error to think that envy, along with covetousness, ambition, and vanity, is a motive force in the development of civilization. It doesn't actually strengthen the acquisitive urge, it weakens it. It leads to ressentiment when the coveted values are such as cannot be acquired and lie in the sphere in which we compare ourselves to others. That is another key aspect to envy, something that he's going to talk about at considerable length and analyze in terms of how we do, in fact, make comparisons. So that is central to envy. But you notice, as I mentioned, that revenge is kind of tied in there, isn't it? I don't have what they have because they've gotten in my way. So I should do something bad to them and maybe just say, bad things about them, right? And so he is going to talk actually about a very interesting kind of envy, which he says is the strongest source of ressentiment. This is existential envy, right? Which is directed against the other person's very nature. He says, it is as if it whispers continually, I can forgive everything but not that you are what you are, that I am not what you are, indeed that I am not you. And he says, this form of envy strips the opponent of his very existence, for his existence as such is felt to be a pressure, a reproach, and an unbearable humiliation. Very similar to what Aristotle, by the way, says about hatred in Rhetoric, Book 2, distinguishing it from anger. Anger, or this desire for revenge, we could say, wants the other to suffer. It doesn't want the other to necessarily not exist, but hatred literally wants the other not to be, meienai in Greek. And so Scheler is saying something kind of similar about envy here. Existential envy as this source of ressentiment. And he goes on and he gives some examples, and he says, besides these cases of existential envy, innate characterizations of individuals, beauty, racial excellence, hereditary character traits, those can be chief causes of ressentiment, envy as well. And so we can have entire groups who have this existential envy against each other as well. So now we've got two important sources. Let's go back for just a moment to revenge, because he does say a few other interesting things about this. He tells us that the following factors contribute to strengthen the preconditions for revenge. The desire for revenge, he says, has powerful repressive tendencies. So how do you get from revenge to ressentiment? You have to not be able to get the revenge that you actually desire. So he says, for example, an injured person places themselves on the same level as their injurer. A slave who has a slavish nature and accepts his status does not desire revenge when injured by their master, nor does a servile servant who is reprimanded or a child that's slapped. Why? Well, because they view it as just fine for that to be done to them. They don't like it, right? But it's when we think that I didn't deserve that, or that person is doing the wrong thing. He also says we should add to the fact that revenge tends to be transformed into ressentiment the more it's directed against lasting situations which are felt to be injurious but beyond one's control. The more the injury, I like this phrase, is experienced as a destiny. You know, somebody is involved in a relationship with me, a romantic relationship, and then they treat me badly, they abuse me, they exploit me, they cheat on me, and then they leave, and I can't do anything about it. Now, you know, I could like stalk them on social media and say bad things and all that. They don't care. They've already moved on. I can't get my revenge. And I consider doing terrible things to them, but I'm afraid of the law, so I can't do that. And then I get involved with another person, right? And, oh, everything's going great, but then they do me wrong as well. And now I'm starting to think, oh, I'm just cursed. I'll never find love. Everybody's treating me badly. Women are all bad, or something like that, right? You see where this is going. Right? So he talks about a number of different examples of this, and he says that you can find some interesting cases. The one that I particularly like is what he calls ressentiment criticism. Criticism without any positive aims. It's characterized by the fact that improvements in the condition criticized cause no satisfaction. They merely cause discontent. They destroy the growing pleasure afforded by invective and negation. Some people just love to bitch and whine, don't they? That's ressentiment, right? And that's them taking revenge against a world that's perceived as unfair, or, you know, the people who've got it good, or the elites, or pick whoever else you want, right? He says that it's peculiar to resentment criticism that it does not seriously desire its demands be fulfilled. It does not want to cure the evil. The evil is merely a pretext for the criticism, right? And so this is criticism moved by ressentiment that came about because of revenge, but there could also be aspects of envy in this. Now, revenge and envy don't have to lead to ressentiment. It's the same thing we can say with some of the other negative affects that we can look at, right? It's possible for them to not produce ressentiment, not to slide into that groove. So he gives the example of what he calls moral self-conquest. What would this be in the case of revenge? You actually forgive the person. That's okay. That's a human possibility. As a matter of fact, that may be a great thing for you to do, because then you're not going to become filled with this poison of ressentiment. I mean, maybe there's some things you shouldn't forgive. That's a whole different discussion that we can have. People maybe forgive too easily. They forgive and they forget. But if you do forgive, you're not going to be filled with ressentiment, provided it's real forgiveness, not fake forgiveness, which, by the way, he will talk about in the third part of the book, which has to do with Christian morality, because a lot of Christians who say that they forgive are only doing it to heap hot coals on the head of their oppressor, which is not real forgiveness. But it's a way out. Is it possible to do that with envy? Yeah, you could let that go too. You could forgive the fact that you're not going to have what other people have and not turn resentful about it. You can also have some sort of adequate expression or action. He talks about shaking your fist in revenge. For some people, that's enough. They don't have to become resentful about that, right? If you're envious, one possibility is you acquire what it is that you want. And if you do acquire it, well, there's no reason for you to be envious anymore. If you're still envious after you've actually got what you want, well, then you're screwed up in a terrible way that, resentment is probably going to take root in you. There's another thing that's involved here, though. Suppression of the emotion, suppression or repression, right? You're not able to fully express it, to act on it. That's when resentment can actually take root within a person, spurred by envy, spurred by the desire for revenge. Do we have any other affects that are connected with this? Well, yes, because he talks about revenge, hatred, malice, envy, the impulse to detract, and spite. And he also notes that with envy and revenge, they tend to have definite objects, whereas the impulse to detract is not necessarily tied to definite objects. It seeks those out, just like vindictiveness seeks out the opportunities to be vindictive, right? He says this affect is looking for those things from which it can draw gratification. We can also talk about spite. When you're doing things that are spiteful, you're doing it not even to get anything out of it, just to screw with somebody else. Malice is about wanting other people to suffer because you enjoy that suffering. It's close to schadenfreude, right? Hatred, the desire to see another destroyed. All of these are things that can feed into ressentiment. But you notice that he also says each one of these is not yet ressentiment. They're only stages in the development of its sources. And you get the idea that Scheler tends to think that although we do have these other affects, these other negative, reactive emotions, that desire for revenge and envy are really the chief sources, the ones that motivate us, the ones that are at greatest risk of feeding into this dynamic that he labels, taking from Nietzsche, ressentiment.